I think it's really underappreciated how dire things would be for Myanmar if the media were to stop reporting on the country. It's an issue that affects everyone.
Hello, and welcome to episode 59 of What's Happening in Myanmar, a weekly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Luke Corbin. It's Friday, January 2, 2026, and I hope you had a nice time over the New Year period. There's certainly been plenty to try and understand in Myanmar, with new resistance offences, exchanges of territory, and of course, a relative deluge of foreign reporters parachuting into the country to report on the first day of voting in the military's so-called elections. That was December 28. So today I'll briefly cover those elections and then the war before introducing two friends of the show to discuss the information environment and reporting in the new Myanmar of 2026 after the elections. We'll be joined by Lorcan Lovett, independent journalist and Substack writer, and Thu Thu Aung, Frontier Myanmar's own editor-in-chief. They've actually both written on this topic recently. Stay tuned for that conversation. But first, the news. Let's start with the ongoing war against military rule in Myanmar. Basically, the unpopular so-called elections surprisingly caused no pause in the war, with a number of advances by resistance forces up the breadth of the country over the last 2 weeks, with most resistance victories taking place in the north. There's been pitched battles, air and drone strikes, and more atrocities against civilians. In general, the momentum has been with the resistance over the election period, with the military scrambling to defend positions, retake positions, and repair infrastructure. In the long drawn-out battle for Bhamo, which has seen the majority of that vibrant trading hub destroyed, the Kachin Independence Army, the KIA, made progress at two key military positions, an infantry battalion HQ and an ordnance depot. More details are sketchy, but it looks like the KIA has taken both bases, and the battalion commander of the depot was killed on Christmas Day. Fighting continues at other locations in the town, including engineering and transport bases. This puts the KIA on the front foot in the new year, but after starting their campaign for Bhamo in 2024, they failed throughout the whole of 2025 to dislodge the military from its key Bhamo base there, the Military Operations Command 21. Can they do it in 2026? Then on election day proper, local resistance groups attacked military administration offices in Sagaing region's Budalin town, taking 3 sites, including a police station. Budalin township has suffered hugely since the military began attacking peaceful protesters way back in 2021. Resistance groups hold the countryside there, but military columns often burn villages and attack civilians when they leave from nearby bases. The military deployed airstrikes in Budalin town, halting resistance forces' advance, and it's unlikely that they'll be able to hold the sites in the town. Given the timing, these attacks seem more likely to be political in nature, making a point rather than trying to take the whole town. In a larger and more dramatic fashion, but similarly, in the Sagaing town of Qatar, People's Defence Forces and allied groups, including the KIA, orchestrated victories this week, starting with an attack on a military base at 3 a.m. on election day. Qatar, of course, is known for being the main location that the author and ambivalent colonialist George Orwell lived in, and it inspired his famous novel Burmese Days. Fighting raged there throughout election day and on, with resistance forces capturing 2 hilltop bases north of the town and entering the streets under intense airstrikes and artillery attack. They took control of buildings and the bus terminal. These battles forced thousands of residents to flee and trapped many hundreds. At least 1 civilian has died. Right now, Qatar remains in limbo. And then, southwest, after a year of analysis and expectations, People's Defence Forces in Mugwe region, under the command of the Alternative National Unity Government, have finally made coordinated attacks on supporting infrastructure and towns around some of the military factories there. These factories are threatened by territorial losses to the Arakan Army to the west and PDFs being active in rural areas. Starting election day, PDFs attacked military positions in Sinpyu-jun, Salin, Bao, Quinpyu and Saipyu towns. PDFs have downed over 100 electricity pylons in the area with the intention to disturb power supply to military factories number 21, number 22 and 24, which manufacture small arms, aerial bombs and aluminium. Military soldiers raced to repair the damage. Analysts expect that if just one military factory in the network was to fail or be comprehensively sabotaged, this would have a chain reaction effect on several others and slow the military's production of arms and bombs. There was also major fighting in Bhamo region, with the NUG PDF claiming 40 soldiers were killed in attacks along the Sitdown River. And there was more fighting in the south, in Mun State's Budalin and Ye townships. Resistance forces dropped drone bombs in Dawei on New Year's Eve, hitting a military checkpoint and injuring civilians. But as usual, the military drone and airstrikes caused most of the misery, with an attack on civilians in Dabayin township. The worst, however, was in Rakhine State's Ngapali, one of Myanmar's few resort towns west of Yangon and under control of the Arakan army. Military bombs there killed 4 children and 5 other civilians on December 30. 14 more were injured, 8 critically. This was the third airstrike mass atrocity committed in Rakhine State by the military in the month of December alone. So, as these offensives, rapidly changing, have raged, what happened on December 28? Well, let's talk about the second development this week, the military's so-called elections. Let's recall that day, this past Sunday, was just the first phase of voting, and it was the culmination of a plan first set in motion when Senior General Min Aung Hlaing broke the 2008 constitution to illegally seize power nearly 5 years ago on the 1st of February 2021. That coup, of course, prevented the members of parliament elected by the 2020 polls from forming a government. That 2020 election was attended by several credible domestic and international observation missions, which declared it largely free and fair. In contrast, this week's military elections were declared by protesters and analysts to be a sham from their very announcement, and no credible observation missions were present for the first stage of voting, unlike in 2015 and 2020. The polls took place in a climate of intense fear, political repression, and coercion. The military did manage to open voting in most of the townships that it declared it would do so, but not all of them. And some areas, like Gathar, for example, were affected by fighting on the day. Now, Frontier Myanmar journalists were on the ground, and they posted a thorough backstage report to Frontier members detailing turnout and public opinion at several polling stations. Turnout was low. The military declared 52% of eligible voters voted, but this number is at the least inflated, if not completely arbitrary, given the Army's failure to determine accurate voter lists before the event. This was a point of concern, remember, even for pro-military and stooge parties in the months leading up to the vote. The figure of 52% also jars with the many anecdotes from Frontier and other reporters of empty voting queues on the day, and their comparisons with the queues in 2020, say, with its 70% turnout rate. Many international journalists from credible outlets entered Myanmar to report on December 28, though they largely struggled to engage beyond superficial observations. A common theme across all reporting was an overwhelming litany of anecdotes from those who did choose to vote. They disclosed they did so out of fear of conscription, of persecution, of political repression. Many said they were coerced and tried to downplay the significance of the vote. And, true to these voters' expectations, the military's Union Solidarity and Development Party declared overall victory on the night of the elections before official results were even released. Officials from Russia, China, Kazakhstan, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Nicaragua were confirmed to be present in the country to supposedly observe the elections. On Monday, the day after, China's Special Envoy for Asian Affairs, Deng Xijun, spoke at a ceremony for these international election observers in Naypyidaw. He declared, quote, "The successful conduct of these elections reflects the agreements and cooperative efforts between Myanmar's acting president, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, and Chinese President Xi Jinping." This seemingly makes explicit what many have been saying all along, that China was a major force in getting these elections to happen. And China will no doubt be a major force in convincing others that these elections were indeed peaceful and legitimate. Deng said, I quote again, "The first part of this election is proceeding smoothly and peacefully." Clearly, Deng and I are reading different news. The second phase of voting is set for January 11, followed by a third phase on January 25. Now turning to our feature interview for this episode. It's a new era for Myanmar as the military tries to solidify its rule with these so-called elections and continues pressuring the information environment, censoring, blocking, restricting access to any facts, contexts and narratives that it deems a threat to its rule. On December 23, independent journalist Lorcan Lovett published a report in Neiman Reports, Myanmar's independent media innovates to survive. It details how US funding has vanished and how Myanmar media competitors are turning into collaborators to keep reporting alive. It's my pleasure to welcome Lorcan to the show to talk about the new media environment for Myanmar in 2026 and Frontier's own Thu Thu Aung, who's also published on this topic. Hello, Lorcan.
Hi, Luke. Happy New Year to you and Happy New Year to Thu Thu and all the listeners. It's great to be back here.
And hello, Thu Thu.
Hello, thank you. Thank you, Luke, for inviting me again.
Thu Thu, can I start with you? Right now, getting quality information to Burmese people that's been fact-checked and is free from bias is really harder than at any time since before censorship was gradually lifted in the early 2010s. You've written a policy report about how a free press can be best sustained during this time. More than that, you actually grew up in military-controlled Myanmar, and you worked there as an adult, as a journalist. So I want to ask you, what do you think are the consequences if the current status quo continues for the country? And what should the international community be doing to improve things?
Thank you so much, Luke, for the question. The current information environment in Myanmar is extremely polarized at the moment, and it's almost impossible to get a full picture from any single source. If the current information environment continues the way it is, Myanmar risks losing more than just independent media outlets or professional journalists. We risk losing a shared understanding of reality. And as you mentioned, I grew up under military rule where censorship was absolute. Today, in some way, getting reliable and fact-check information is harder than it was back then. Not because there's no information, but because there's too much unverified and polarized information. People became more vulnerable to propaganda, partly because of the platforms such as TikTok and Facebook. And perhaps more worrying of all, we risk putting people into information bubbles where they only hear what they already believe. On top of that, the situation is made much worse by social media influencers and organized propagandists on platforms like TikTok. So this is really important. That's why it is so important to think seriously about how to rebuild a healthy information system for people in Myanmar. And the international community has a real role to play here in demanding greater accountability for people from digital platforms. And also, I think one more important thing, it is really crucial to retain the talent in the industry. We cannot afford to lose these talent. This is why I have set up a talent network at Frontier, and you can see some of the reporting on our platform. Without a healthy information ecosystem, it becomes much harder to rebuild trust and social cohesion later on. Yeah.
Thank you, Thu Thu. You've really outlined the stakes there very well. Now, Lorcan, congratulations to you on your recent publication. Could you first maybe give us more detail on the quite dire decisions that have been made in the last year leading to this situation, to such a paucity of funding reaching independent Myanmar media organizations?
Yes, sure. It's been a dramatic year for funding for Myanmar media. Over the last year, there's been some European countries who have diverted their funding from Myanmar. And they usually cite security back home, which basically means Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But the biggest blow happened at the beginning of last year with the withdrawal of US funding. So that was last March. The Trump administration cut funding for Voice of America and Radio Free Asia. These were both really important Burmese language services that bypassed junta censorship. And it meant so much to the regime that regime leader Min Aung Hlaing publicly thanked Trump, if you remember. So those were gone. The US aid cuts, which all comes from the Trump administration's decision to withdraw funding, those were a key source of funding for a media development partner. So that's like a kind of intermediary that oversees how the funding is spent. They're called internews. And they lost a lot of funding as well. So the money that they were going to give to Myanmar outlets, they even asked Myanmar outlets to return some of that money. And some of them did return it as well because they're worried that they might not receive future funding if they didn't. And then another hit came when Sweden announced in September that it would end development aid to Myanmar, which means, according to Human Rights Myanmar, a loss of 2.4 million annually to Myanmar media. That's a huge number for Myanmar media. And now this might be something of an exclusive for the podcast, though again, it's not good news for independent Myanmar media. The German government funding for Myanmar outlets that's been in place since the coup ended a few days ago. A well-placed source emailed me the other day to say that. So I'm not sure if it's been reported yet, but the German government is also out. So as you know, Myanmar media relies heavily on foreign donors. One estimate given to me was 80% overall. Another interviewee estimated that 8 to 10 million is needed annually to fund basic operations for about 50 Myanmar outlets. So 8 to 10 million is not a huge number in the broader picture of the world and donor funding, but that would be enough to keep 50 outlets going. And only 25% of that is covered at the moment, and that's decreasing. So maybe the age of democracies funding independent media is over, or maybe it'll come back if there's a new US administration who turns the tap back on and other countries might follow. But for now, it's very clear that Myanmar media must find a sustainable, self-sufficient solution, which is easier said than done.
Definitely, yeah. Now, Thu Thu, I want to bring you in here because Frontier is slightly different to the other organizations that Lorcan's mostly talking about. You know, Frontier doesn't focus on daily reporting. So from your point of view, what are the current challenges for reporting Frontier's feature stories and in-depth analytical work?
So our reporting depends on people inside Myanmar. Majority of our journalists are also in Myanmar. So protecting journalists and sources is always the first priority, and it is the top challenge. And also that limits on-the-ground reporting and slows everything down. And reaching to sources, especially in Rakhine or Chin or Kachin, and verifying information can take days, sometimes weeks, because of the security risks, and also because of the connectivity problems. There's internet blackouts in those areas. So feature reporting also, not only feature reportings, all the reportings on Myanmar takes a heavy mental toll. Our journalists are constantly working with traumatic materials while living with their own insecurity. They have to scare off everything, right? They might be arrested, or if the authority found out that they are journalists. That is exactly what my policy report highlights. Quality journalism in a conflict requires times, safety and stability. Without the stable and long-term support for security, mental health, and it became almost impossible to sustain in-depth reporting at the standards that we believe are essential. These are the challenges.
Yeah, so some of the challenges for Frontier are shared by the others. Now, Lorcan, you wrote that detailed piece that I mentioned already, and it's about really how organizations like Democratic Voice of Burma, Irrawaddy, Myanmar, they share a lot in common. They were born out of the 1988 protests and coup, but they don't actually have a great history of collaborating. Now that they're banding together, how's it playing out? What do they hope to achieve? You did some really great interviews for this piece.
They're banding together out of necessity. As you mentioned, they know each other quite well. They go way back to the 1988 uprising times. And they've come together to cut costs and to try to make it through this very rough patch. So yeah, those four, DVB, Irrawaddy, Myanmar Now, Mizima, and then Burma News International, of which Mizima is a member. BNI represents 14 ethnic outlets. And I think you could trace it back to February 2025, when they signed a joint memorandum calling for greater transparency in how donor funds were being spent, including a more detailed accounting of fees paid to media development intermediaries. Editors basically wanted to see what little donor funds were left spent as efficiently as possible. So the memo also urged donors to provide longer-term kind of core support instead of support for specific projects, and to help outlets build revenue streams as well. So after that, the collaboration became a bit closer. They applied together for European Commission funding, which I think was the first time. A lot of these interviewees used the word like unprecedented, this is the most collaboration we've done than ever. I don't think they were successful with the European Commission funding. As one interviewee said, everybody's going after Europe funding at the moment. But they did go to Europe and tour some European capitals to try to drum up support. What other ways are they working together? Well, they've established a hotline to share information on donors and visitors and investigations, and to tackle issues like website security. One thing I found interesting was that editors reported an increase in cyber attacks, mainly from IP addresses in Russia and China, which are both close allies of the regime. And so they need to work together to protect their websites. Outlets have shared content and stories with each other, which wasn't really happening before. And 3 launched a joint readership donation drive, which was fronted by Aung San Suu Kyi's son, Kim. And 1 lent studio space to another. So things like that. It's helping to cut costs. And as I report in that piece, it's also triggered some concerns among smaller outlets that a collaboration between the biggest outlets could push the smaller ones off the donors' radar at a very difficult time. So I think the goal now is survival for everybody, finding a way through this moment while continuing to report.
Can they all make it through? I mean, how far can this collaboration go? Do you think that it makes sense in the current climate for there to be these 4 large, distinct exile daily news organisations reporting on Myanmar and so reliant on international funding?
When it comes to media, I'm very much in like the more the merrier camp. But in the current condition, is it realistic? Is it practical? I think we'll see. It seems like their collaboration will likely continue and deepen as the funding crisis worsens, which it probably will. No one has told me any outlets will merge, but obviously if things get really bad, that could be one prospect. If there's enough space for daily news organizations, I think with donors out of the equation, in my opinion, it would be a simple case of the market deciding. When the market decides, not only do you need to distinguish yourself with original, compelling, accurate reporting, but you need to capture the audience's attention with that and then find a way to monetize it. That's not easy to do anywhere in the world, never mind Myanmar. But people say necessity is the mother of invention, so they need to innovate to survive. And I think it's going to be interesting to see what comes from it. I would say as well that I think it's really underappreciated how dire things would be for Myanmar if the media were to stop reporting on the country. It's an issue that affects everyone, so everybody has to become very creative now in order to find a path forward. With like the donor related money, that isn't always necessarily about quality. It's a lot of politics in that, but now it'll be the market that will decide. So maybe they'll come up with some ideas. Maybe they'll do like I don't know. I was thinking when I was writing this piece, maybe there's a way forward with a kind of Spotify model where you pay a few dollars a month and then you get access to all content from 4 outlets and then they get a share of it. That's obviously that presents lots of problems down the line about who gets what share, etc. But I mean, yeah, people are going to need to do something quite different to survive, I think.
Yeah, right. So if we think about this, turning to you again, Thu Thu, the market deciding, Frontier has had a subscription model for 5 years now. Of course, some things remain free, like this podcast, for example. But I wanted to ask you, if donor funding dwindles further, do you think that membership, subscription or paywall models, are they the best way forward for everyone? What advice would you give? Of course, Myanmar people obviously can't afford to pay high fees to access information.
Oh, thank you, Luke. So Frontier membership model started in 2020, before COVID time, mainly to generate revenues from our journalism and also how we collaborate with our readers. So it's really important, right, to know the readers, who are your audience. So then you can say your products. We can think like business people or entrepreneurs. So we need to know what is our specialty. So if they can make the products, desired by the audience, the customer, then they can be successful in that kind of model. And 1/3 of our Frontier funding is from membership programs. So we are, compared to other media outlets, we are in a better place. But for 2/3, we still relying on donors. The situation and uncertain, we need to find a way to survive. And also, like you mentioned, in Myanmar, most people cannot afford to pay for news. Many don't even have reliable access to digital payments. If the authority, hunter, military leader found out that a local person paying to an ARE or Myanmar Now, they will be jailed for years. That's why since I joined, I have been translating all of our articles in Burmese for Myanmar audience, and also we have 2 podcasts, including What is Happening in Myanmar, Do It Then, Human Rights Podcast, available for free. We don't want to lock Myanmar people out of information that is essential. And I believe that it is essential to provide access to quality information for people in Myanmar. So we have to balance how will we provide the information to the people, also how will we sustain ourselves. That's a big question. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a huge question. And not just the Myanmar context. I mean, the global technological changes are just awe-inspiring, really. Lorcan, this was kind of in the background of your piece, but you don't dwell on it explicitly. The role of technology. I want to ask you about this. How's the new web, Web 3.0 or 4.0, artificial intelligence, the AI-inflected digital world? This is the context that all media organizations around the world are working in now. How is this affecting what they can and can't do? Is this a tech arms race that is in dictatorship's favor, or is it in democracy's favor?
That's a really interesting, huge question, and one I am deeply underqualified to answer. I think it would take a lot of research to give a comprehensive, solid answer. Nonetheless, I'll give it a go. So I think technology has obviously enhanced the capabilities of all newsrooms. In the Myanmar context, things like VPNs and secure messaging apps like Telegram, Signal means that we can report on the situation as long as you have an internet connection. Or in some areas, you don't even need an internet connection. They can still report without it just by being very dedicated. I think AI tools are helping a lot with translation, right, between Burmese and ethnic languages and Burmese and English, which goes a long way when you're underfunded, because that can do a lot of the kind of production work for you. As for the military or the dictatorship and what benefits it gets, I think it's probably benefiting the military even more than it is the opposition and exiled media, especially when you think about things like surveillance and facial recognition, which I think the military are developing now. They're deploying some Chinese tech in that field. And probably on the battlefield, right, with the growing AI use in drone warfare, as we've seen in other conflicts. I asked actually a few months ago a couple of resistance groups about how they'd been using AI on the battlefield, but it didn't seem like they were using it in any significant way. But maybe that's changed now. Also, like how the military is using AI to manipulate social media users, I think is something that is very, well, it hasn't been explored yet, but it would be great to look into that. And then the things that we all use now, most of us use in our day-to-day lives, are the LLMs, like ChatGPT. These are being used a lot, I think, to summarize interviews, to edit copy, even to write copy, probably. But that should be approached with a lot of caution, in my opinion. You know, if you're a small newsroom, you can post a lot more by using AI LLMs, but the copy might seem like superficially slick, and it often sounds quite empty, you know, unless actual reporting has been done. And these things, like these tools, they often hallucinate. So fact checking for accuracy is more important than ever. And then if it gets to a point where everybody posts like AI generated content and original reporting takes a back seat, no one's going to read anything. So, you know, what's the point? But yeah, so I think those are my initial thoughts on that.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you for giving that a shot, Lorcan. Last questions for both of you. Okay, so I mentioned already at the beginning of the show in the news that huge number of international media organizations went to Myanmar. I mean, not a huge number, but relatively, if you think about the last 5 years, many went to Myanmar to cover these elections. I wanted to ask you both to evaluate the independent media's attempts to cover these elections and the international media's attempts to cover the elections. And then also, do you think that the people of Myanmar are still engaging with independent media? Is there a tendency to just switch off when the military is continuing with this same old playbook? Everybody knows the elections are a sham. How do you deal with that as a person struggling to put food on the table, for example?
I think the independent media has done a good job. At Frontier, we have done multiple in-depth pieces looking at different aspects of the situation and what to look for ahead. And also we have done on the ground reporting on the election day. I think Myanmar people are still engaging, though it can be really hard to tell because we don't have any data on that. Having said that, I am myself an editor of an independent media outlet. Maybe I will defer to Lorcan for his opinion. No?
Mm-hmm. Well, I thought that Frontier, I'm not just saying this because I'm on the podcast today, but I thought Frontier's backstage piece where 3 reporters were at polling stations in Yangon and Naypyidaw gave us really, really great ground insights and kind of, you know, those vox pops which were weaved in, giving us an idea about what people were thinking on that day. So yeah, I'm not just saying that because I'm here, but I thought that was the best piece that I've read about this fake election. I mean, the rigged vote itself isn't that interesting because the winners were decided 5 years ago on the day of the coup, right? But one wild card was how much attacks would disrupt voting. And there were a few bombings which unfortunately hit civilians. So it's going to be something to keep an eye on for the next 2 phases. I thought overall the coverage was really pretty good for local and international. I thought the BBC did a good piece as well. Coverage, it got all the core elements and it told an international audience, you know, the most important parts about how Myanmar people see this election as a military attempt to legitimize its rule and how voter enthusiasm was low and opposition was banned, all those important aspects to communicate. And kind of, I think it's more interesting times ahead, right, about Min Aung Hlaing and whether him delegating authority in a dictatorship can create rivals, whether he can find the right subordinate to carry on for him, or what will happen in that regard. So I look forward to more reporting on that. I will ask Thu Thu, though, if you don't mind. I'm a bit torn about this sham election because on one hand, I think, well, as I said, the winner's already been decided. It's not that big a deal. The war goes on. People continue to fight. The country's still in a crisis. But then on the other hand, I think, oh, well, actually, if the international community does just accept this rigged vote, maybe things will change for the resistance as well. So that's what I'd like to ask Thu Thu is, do you think this election is going to have a real impact in strengthening the dictatorship? Or what do you think will happen?
It's really depend, Logan. You just like asking me a really difficult question. But I think this election won't bring many impact. It depends on how they will found the government and who will take the position. But I have little hope that it will change the country situation. But the resistance will also have to, show their move. Like, we don't really see the move yet. So it's all depend on how the opposition will make a strategic move, or like how will they found the government,
Yeah, I think that the pressure's on the opposition. Sorry to put you on the spot then, but I agree.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good question though. I also trying to find a person who can answer that question.
Yeah, I can't.
For the soons, yeah.
Let me quickly chime in also and answer my own question, if you don't mind. I thought that seeing so many, international reports from on the ground in Myanmar during this election period actually really highlighted the value of independent Myanmar media, because so many of these foreign journalists were really hobbled by the fact that they were being followed around by, military, police, officials. They felt like they couldn't really talk to people freely, get proper interviews done. There was a sort of superficiality to the international coverage that really highlighted to me, that really made me feel gratified at, there's the skill, the networks, the tenacity of independent media in Myanmar. So yeah, that was my takeaway from reading everything that came out of the elections and comparing the two. So I think that independent media is doing a wonderful job, and I really, really hope that it can continue to do so throughout the rest of 2026.
Yeah, that's well said, Luke. I agree with that as well. I think people might have learned from the past mistakes. I remember just after the coup, CNN went to Yangon and interviewed 2 women, I think, on camera. And then both of those women were arrested. So that must have been in a lot of journalists' minds as they went out to Yangon.
Yes.
Yeah, and the military shows no sign of any lenience in that sort of regard. If you think about the Zicho protests recently in Mandalay, they just went in and detained anybody that happened to be filmed just being in the vicinity. That's what they do. All right. That brings us to the end of our conversation. I really enjoyed it. I want to thank you, Lorcan and Thu Thu, for coming on the show, the first episode of 2026. I hope to have you both back on later in the year. And Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
And a big Jizu Myaji Dinbare to all our listeners that returned for more What's Happening in Myanmar in the new year and listened through to the end. I had a good break, but it's a real pleasure to be back now in the digital studio. It goes without saying, given the content of this episode, but, remember that independent media in Myanmar needs your support. Not just Frontier, not just the big 5 exile organizations, but the smaller outlets too. So do consider donating. Now, until next week, farewell and take care.